Welcome back, Red Eyes members. It's great to have you with us. We are talking with Dan Winter about, pretty much all and everything at this point. Very, very interesting discussion about the golden mean, fractality, gravity, electromagnetism, sacred geometry, and we even talked about our past, our genetic and historical past, as it were. And I'd like to begin this segment to talk a little bit more about architecture and ask you, Dan, if you will, if you have any kind of suggestions in regards to materials or the type of house that the people could live in to better harness, the properties of fractality and what we've been talking about in the first segment. I myself am personally interested in building straw bale houses, for instance. Do you have any input on that, or have you spent any of your time building a house or maybe even drawing up plans for a house, Dan?
Well, yes, we are doing these conferences on biologic architecture all the time. And at goldenmean.info/architecture, as we mentioned, you'll see the work of Michael Rice, holistichouseplans.com, and Olda from Prague. You'll see many examples. The sequence of steps, roughly, of course, is you need a magnetic map of your site, and the place where the magnetic lines is centered most like a rose is a good start for getting the compression that will cause life force, the sweet chi, of course. The basement should be built without metal. They're using slate blocks and things like that. The walls are made of organic material and have natural convection air moving up through them. The steel and aluminum is almost entirely eliminated. Almost exclusively biologic materials, stone throughout. Steiner taught that the children should never touch metal and plastic and synthetics. And the same is true for everyone, because that's what kills your aura if the charge can't propagate through it. Your key steps are really magnetic mapping and biologic materials. I could give you a little thought about the straw bale question.
Yeah, sure.
I started on this question in part through my work with Phil Callahan, who I worked with for years. And, of course, he was a radar engineer in the Wales, I believe, during the war. And he realized that everyone in this one village was living to be over 100 years old. And he tried to figure out why. He went into their straw houses and realized that when you walked in, your hair would stand up. The charge was so great.
Really?
And he figured out why. The hemp, particularly, or straw, when you take the mist of the trace mineral of a sea spray and then bake it in the sun and do that recursively, you create a fabulous biological fractal capacitor, which pretty much defines a bioactive electric field. So those ancient straw buildings baked in the sun with sea spray were creating capacitors in which everyone was living to be over 100 years old. That's a good start for understanding what you need with a building. You could even try in your straw bale house to spray some live seawater, hopefully from the depth, and leave it bake in the sun several times. And you'll find the capacitance becomes more fractal, more harmonic inclusive, more phase conjugate, defining the ability to germinate a seed with that electric field, which is really the definition of architecture.
Wow, that's really interesting. And if you don't mind me asking, how are you living? Do you incorporate any of this in your own way that you live?
Well, we live in a little village here in South France now. It is a clay, a ceramic kind of building, but it's far from perfect, sadly. But real estate is location, location, and location.
Sure.
One thing we did right here, if you do a 3D animation of the mountain that we live on called Canigou, the sacred Cathar mountain, it turns out to be a pine cone, literally. And the name for that is called Perpignan, which is where we're near. And it's halfway on the line between the Magdalen Tower at Rennes-le-Château and the Magdalen Tower at Girona.
Really?
Giron, which is the phase conjugate point where the wizard called Twin Towers in Lord of the Ring at Aragon, which is the name of the area. And they would find themselves projected to the top of the Mount Canigou when they did their spell. So the phase conjugate point is the place to live. And there's a certain magnetic line going through this house on which I have seen through the sun from that magnetic line.
Okay. Would you care to tell us more about that? That's very interesting.
Bit of a story, but years ago I started an e-group called the Solar Shamans. It's now called the Solar Heart Community at yahoogroups.com with another Kundalini counselor, Susan Carlson. And we had gathered a large number of shaman who had one experience in common of vividly remembering going through the sun. And they were consciously aware of what it was like to project their focus through the eye of the sun. Actually, that's the name of a place where we do seminars on this in Tintagel in Cornwall.
Mm-hmm.
And the eye of the sun turns out to be, the center of the sun is not hot. It's actually cool and inviting. It's an eyeball and organ of perception, as is any phase conjugate field. The geometry there is called Anu, which is 7 spins out, 5 in, and a bit of a long story based on the heart of hydrogen and fusion. But the heart of the sun is a compression place for charge through which everything in the solar system is sorted based on the wavelengths of hydrogen. And it's kind of like the ring pass knot. If you want to get out of here alive, that's the only way out. Huh. And so this is why your ancestors, the An, Ezun, Anu, and Anunnaki, were called sun gods. Right. A sun god is one whose DNA makes a phase conjugate dielectric field which is coherent enough to penetrate through the heart of the sun.
And what you're saying is that as a conscious being, you can tap into this and see through the sun in that sense, then?
Yes. The sun will allow you the privilege of seeing through its eye in the same way as the earth allowed Bentov to see through its eye in his book, Cosmic Comic Book After Stalking the Wild Pendulum, as a result of his Kundalini.
How about, sorry to interrupt there, but how about the nature of the sun, if we go into that a little bit, because I think it's interesting, for instance, when we talked about CMEs before, coronal mass ejections, when you have these areas that are opening up, you always see that it's a black inside of the sun, meaning that it seems to be almost like, well, some people have postulated that it's a black hole for lack of a better term, but it's actually it's a hollow area inside of the sun, and it's the how should I phrase this, the effect of what the sun is doing is what we can see at the surface level, but inside it's actually pretty much nothing visible. Do you have any input on that, Dan?
Well, there was some speculation that just like the phonon wave of the Earth's iron-hot core was dodeca, that the key to the alchemy of the Earth's magnetic, but that the solar core, in fact, is, if you look at the solar flare symmetries, ultimately going to be recursive and pentadodeca and golden ratio based, as we know, is precisely what the clairvoyants saw when they saw the heart of the sun, Leadbeater and Besant and Babbitt, when they drew the Anu in the first place, 7 spin, 5 spin symmetry, which is also ophanic, by the way. So the heart of the sun is clearly a place where plasma compression has become non-destructive, and charge acceleration from that place is therefore possible. And that's where you get into these song lines going between stars, the kind of Jodie Foster contact kind of thing.
That it's a place where you can jump to other solar systems, or what?
Yes. And another way of saying this in simpler terms is, if your ET arrived in heavy metal, you know they're low end and from the wrong side of the track. If they arrived in an electric field, which is phase conjugate made of genetic material and came through the heart of the sun, then those ETs are worth talking to.
Well, that's an interesting input for sure. So do you think that this has been done in the past? Or is being done right now even then, perhaps?
If you read Anton Park's concept of Stargate, it's actually the charge compression portal, which was used for transportation quite practically. For example, our word Jerusalem, where they have all the wars, the meaning of the word in Sumerian, Anunnaki, and Draco was Uru Asa LM, the place where the Uru, Usu the dragon, Asa queens, made the L or phase shift. It's literally a implosive charge compression device, just like Amenti was for Akhenaten.
That's interesting.
There's ancient soul memories about having wars over these places, which is what the war in the Middle East is really about, because it's literally true. If you cannot access a bliss temple, a Shem, then you have very little chance of going back through the sun, and your DNA knows that it's fatal to be stuck below the speed of light, unlike your doctor who doesn't know.
And you mentioned something else there about not being a nuts and bolts type of craft. If we talk about crafts from other planets and so forth, or other civilizations, that they actually have potentially a living material that they transport themselves in, right?
The Aldebaran culture we hear uses genetic-based material craft, whereas the Morphal and Nephilitic Draco use the metallic, which include the craft which An brought from Draco through Pleiades here. Although the Nibiru concept, if we read Anton Parks, was actually a spurious moon that came off of Marduk inside of Jupiter and is now Mercury.
Okay, Mercury, huh? Okay, interesting. I heard that Venus has been expelled from Jupiter.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I think you're right. I believe it's Venus. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Anton Parks, it's Venus, right?
Yes.
And interestingly, see, the Venus has that profound pent recursive retrograde orbit, and the moon has a precisely 13-circuit retrograde orbit. And if you think of what that does, I believe one of the reasons the hollow metal titanium moon is the mechanism of our quarantine is its 13-circuit retrograde orbit, the physics of Mayan calendric, because the quarantine is established by the non-phase conjugate, non-phase conjugate capacitive cocoon, which the moon establishes by its 13-circuit orbit.
Okay, and you're saying that the moon then is an artificial object, a craft?
I believe the NASA seismic data confirmed it was hollow and metal. The story is that it's titanium, that it was towed in here with a rather destructive purpose.
But isn't at the same time the moon utilizing things as the tides on this planet, which actually have in one sense, at this stage at least, are making sure that life is stable on this planet? Because if the tide would go, then things that we know at least would be gone, right?
It's a controversial question, and I know people think it's sort of a bit rebellious, but the Andromedans suggested towing it away, and I think they're probably right. But one thing that's for sure, if we look at the clairvoyant sightings on the backside of the moon, who was the famous remote viewer who viewed the backside of the moon? I'll think of it in a minute. But very scary place. It's not good. And you can see why. When Gurdjieff was right, incoherent emotion will always feed the moon. Coherent emotion will always feed the sun. Now we know the physics of why. The moon is precisely opposite to phase conjugate, hollow and metal, which is pretty much the definition of evil, which is why during a full moon, the best thing you can do is duck.
What? Really? Okay. That's very interesting, because to me it seems like it's a perfect balance between, well, again, I mean, in symbolic terms, you have the sun and the moon, and I mean, even look at when the eclipses take place, the perfect alignment that takes place. It seems to me that, at least, as you, I guess, are alluding to and suggesting here, is that we are indeed part of some kind of experiment. And in that sense, Earth, as you said before, then is this genetic arc, right, where many different species and different kinds of plants and so forth have been I don't know ultimately what the purpose for the experiment is, but we're here.
The library was valuable,
right?
But we need to recognize that a place where parasites are invited is opposite to fractal, and that is precisely why the moon is so full of parasites. Mars was, on the other hand, sort of part of the transition. It was used as a stationary by the Anunnaki Draco, but then they miscalculated the incident angle of asteroid trajectory, and it lost its orbit, precisely correlate to its loss of magnetohydrodynamic, its magnetic field. So loss of atmosphere on Mars, called total recall, is a big part of that memory experiment.
Really interesting. So suggests that other people are knowing what's going on as well, because they're making movies about it, right?
Yeah. But as I say, people who find this history story, and I think Anton Parks again is the best. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think Michael Sarian's a sweet guy on the Celtic, but he's profoundly confused when it comes to John Dee and the Anunnaki. Profoundly confused, sadly. Nice guy, but people who think this history story is too controversial, that's fine. I wouldn't argue with them. What I would say is learn the physics and dump the history. I mean, the physics is simple. If you look at the moon, you see why it's pretty much the definition of evil. It is because it is so opposite to phase conjugate.
Sorry to cut you up, but I can't. To me, it creates the balance, meaning that without that part, it would not create the properties that we have on this planet, which to me makes no sense. It seems to be that we're in a symbolic way, in a mythological way, also, that these two bodies